Thank you very much to everybody involved in bringing me here at the Víctor Grífols Foundation. It's a great pleasure to be back in Barcelona. It's a city I've been to before, but it's always a pleasure to come back to. And I'm very happy to have the chance to give these two lectures and to talk about the two issues that I'm probably most involved with, most concerned in, that I think are really at the center of my practical philosophical work. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. As you heard, doing the most good, and the subtitle is the effective altruism movement. And what I want to do is partly a matter of describing an emerging movement, and partly a matter of looking at the philosophical questions, particularly the ethical questions, that movement gives rise to. So, firstly, what is the effective altruism movement? It's very probable that most of you in the audience have not heard of it, because it is something that's quite new, and the term effective altruism is not yet very well understood. Although at the same time, it is something that, as far as my work goes, one could see connected to one of the very first articles that I published, an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality, that was published in the journal Philosophy and Public Affairs in 1972. So more than 40 years ago now. But the movement, I think, is something that is relatively new, mostly associated with people who are fairly young, a lot younger than I am, and who often have backgrounds in philosophy. So here's an example. Oh, sorry, before I come to that. Here's a definition of what is understood by the movement, which comes out of that universal source of knowledge, Wikipedia. Not always completely reliable, but I think on this occasion it does present a good definition of what we're talking about. The page itself is relatively new, has not been there for a very long time, but it says it's both a philosophy and a social movement, so both an outlook on life, philosophy in that sense, an approach to life, and a social movement that applies evidence and reason to working out the most effective ways to improve the world. So I'm going to say a little bit more about that as the lecture continues, because obviously there are questions you can ask about what is effective, how do we consider improving the world. All of those questions need to be discussed. People standing at the back, there are plenty of seats down the front. If you wanted to take a seat, feel free to come down. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to give you an example of somebody who is one of the people who's been influential in starting the effective altruist movement. This is a man called Toby Ord. He is currently a researcher in philosophy at the University of Oxford, where prior to that he did his doctoral degree in philosophy. What's significant about Toby is that he didn't just do a doctorate in theoretical philosophy. He decided to live in accordance with the philosophical beliefs that he thought to be right. And in order to do that, he decided the best way to do that was to limit the amount that he spent on himself and give the rest of it away. So the amount that he decided to live on was something that he felt able to live on as a student, as a doctoral student, and he didn't really think that he needed significantly more than that. It's, at least by British standards, it's a relatively modest amount, but he felt that it was enough to give him a comfortable lifestyle and also to give him and his wife some additional amounts, for example, so that they could take a holiday, travel to Europe for a holiday or something like that. That's still possible within the budget that Toby set himself. Now, you might ask, so why did he do this? What was he thinking of when he did this? Well, the thought occurred to him that during his life, he was likely to earn quite a lot more than he needed to live on. As I say, this was roughly the amount he thought that he needed to live on. And then he thought, how much am I likely to earn during my lifetime above that amount? Just assuming that I have a normal academic career, not anything that's particularly high salary kind of work, but just a sort of standard academic career. And he calculated how much he would earn above that amount. And then he calculated, what could I do with that? So he looked at some figures for some of the things that you can do in the world that do good for rather little money. So here's one of them. This is a clinic in Africa that treats people at risk of trachoma. If you don't know what trachoma is, it's the most common cause of preventable blindness in the world. It causes a very large number of people to go blind. Numbers are in the millions. It's caused by an insect-borne infestation that gets into the eye. It does not bring about blindness immediately. Gradually, people with trachoma lose their sight over a period of perhaps 15 years, when gradually their sight gets worse. But then, if it's untreated, they will go blind. So the children in the front who are quite young, if they have trachoma, not all of them of course do, but some of them probably do, they could expect to be blind by the time they're, say, 30 years old. But the treatment is inexpensive. There are different estimates. I think Toby used an estimate of about $25 per case of blindness prevented if trachoma is treated. Some people think that that estimate is too low. Maybe you need to multiply it by 4, get to something like $100 per treatment. Even so, obviously, that's an extremely small sum to prevent somebody being blind from middle age or earlier for the rest of their life. And what Toby worked out was that with the amount that he would be able to donate with what he earned, after deducting what he needed to live the kind of comfortable life that he thought was adequate, he thought that he would be able to prevent 80,000 people going blind. And when he thought about that, he thought, there's just really no comparison between preventing 80,000 people from being blind for a substantial part of their life, let's say 15 or 20 years at least, and what the money, what extra enjoyment, if you like, the money might give to his life, if indeed it would give any extra. So when he weighed up those two things, that's why he decided that this was what he ought to do, that he ought to limit his own expenses. So that's characteristic of the thinking of an effective altruist. Altruist because trying to do the most good, effective because trying to find the best way of doing that, trying to look at the evidence as to what can one do that will have the biggest result per dollar or euro or pound that you spend on it. Here's somebody else who didn't actually come out of philosophy, somebody who did a social work degree, Julia Wise, an American living in the Boston area. And she came to this more or less by herself because even as a child, when she learnt that there were people who didn't have enough food to eat, whereas she always had enough food to eat, she thought, there's something wrong here in a way. If I buy an ice cream when I already have enough food to eat, but I just would enjoy an ice cream, that money could have helped somebody who didn't have enough to eat have a meal that day. And so already as a child, she wondered whether it was right for her to buy an ice cream. Well, later on, when she got to the point where she was earning her own money, she decided that she didn't need as much as she was earning, although initially she was not earning a lot by American standards. Again, a relatively sort of, I guess, not poor but not rich, more or less in the middle kind of income of when she was earning $40,000 a year, she still donated 1/3 of her income, quite a substantial proportion. Now she and her husband, she's married now, are earning more, but she's donating about half, at least, of her income. And I'd recommend, if you want to know more about her, to look at, she writes a blog called givinggladly.com about her life, about what she can still manage to afford, and it makes good reading, and I think it's indicative of a different perspective on effective altruism. I want to introduce one third person. I'm going back to Oxford here, somebody who's actually has worked with Toby Ord and has established an organization called Giving What We Can. So GWWC here, Giving What We Can. I'll show you a page from their website later. He also founded another organization called 80,000 Hours. So he and Toby, I should say, together with Toby, they did Giving What We Can. Will founded 80,000 Hours. What's 80,000 hours about? That's roughly the number of hours that most people spend on their career. In other words, in their working life. If you're working 35 hours a week for the number of years that most people work in their career, you might spend 80,000 hours doing that. So the decision of what to do in your career is clearly an important decision. It's a decision about how to spend 80,000 hours. That's worth thinking about, isn't it? But although lots of people think about their career, relatively few of them think about it in terms of what would be an ethical career for me to pursue. And those who do think about that often think about it in a fairly narrow range. So they might think about, should I go and work for an aid organization? Or should I train to be a doctor so that I can go to a developing country and improve health conditions there? Well, those are both possibilities, but Will thought that they're not the only possibilities. And so in 80,000 Hours, he discusses some other possibilities. This is the website for 80,000 Hours. As you see, it talks about which jobs help people most, which subjects should I study, who should I volunteer for, which charities should I give to. And it's trying to set up a community of people who are thinking about an ethical career. Now, here's one of them. And he made a choice that you might initially think is a strange choice to make for somebody who's making an ethical career choice. This is Matt Wager, who was one of my students at Princeton just a couple of years ago. And he did very well in philosophy. He was a very bright student. He also had studied maths. So he could have gone on with an academic career of the sort that Toby Ord, for example, or Will MacAskill are having, or the sort that I've had. He could have gone on to graduate school, done a doctorate, and had a good chance of becoming eventually a professor somewhere. But after talking to people like Will MacAskill and others about what would be the best thing to do, he came to a choice that, as I say, you might find surprising. He went into, essentially, he went to work for Wall Street, you could say. He went into finance in New York City. Well, here's why. Because he thought, if I earn a lot of money, I'll be able to donate a lot of money to effective charities. And where can somebody with a degree from an elite university like Princeton, especially if they have skills in mathematics, where can they earn the most money? I think the answer pretty clearly is going into the finance industry. And as you can see, only a year after graduating, Will was obviously earning more than $100,000 a year because he was able to donate $100,000 a year, and he needed some to live on. So you would have to say that at least so far, he was right that this would enable him to donate more to effective charities than any other career that you can think of. Now, I know that there's a couple of things that you might be thinking about here. You might, for example, think, well, if he's such a clever person, couldn't he have also done a lot of good going to work for a charity? And the answer to that is, probably he could have. But here's one difference that influenced his thinking. Suppose that he had applied to work for a charity. Let's say he was going to work for Oxfam. You have a Spanish version of Oxfam. So let's say he was going to work for that organization, or for Oxfam America, as he's an American. There are many people who would like to work for Oxfam. It's something that a lot of people think of as their ideal, to work for a well-known aid organization. So for every job that Oxfam advertises, you can be sure that there's a strong field of applicants. And if Will had applied, let's assume that he had got the job, the difference that he would make would be only the marginal difference between what he could do for Oxfam and what the second best person in the field could do for Oxfam. Assume that Matt is the best person in the field. Well, there would have been somebody else probably almost as good who would have got the job if he had not been in the field. So, how much more good could he do than the second best person? Probably a little bit, if Oxfam makes good selections, a little bit, but not very much more, just a little bit. Now, think about Matt going into finance. Of course, in one sense, the same thing applies. If Matt had not got the job with the trading firm that he now works for, somebody else almost as good would have got it. But what Matt is trying to do is to do the most good in the world by, for instance, reducing global poverty. So the next person in the field for the job at the trading firm that Matt is working for would almost certainly not have donated $100,000 a year to a charity working effectively to reduce global poverty, because unfortunately, most people working in the finance industry don't do that. They spend the money on buying some nice new car or some lavish apartment, or traveling to luxurious hotels, something of that sort. So there's a big difference between the amount of good that Matt can do if he gets the job and the amount of good that the next person working for the finance company would have been able to do. In fact, the difference is what you can see here, probably like $100,000 a year, and perhaps more if Matt's earnings increase and he can give more. Well, $100,000 a year is a lot of money. Oxfam doesn't pay the people that it employs, at least initially in their first year or two, doesn't pay them $100,000 a year. Perhaps it pays them $50,000 a year. So if Matt donates $100,000 a year to Oxfam, let's say, they could hire two new people that they wouldn't have been able to hire before. And the chances are that two extra people would do much more good for Oxfam than the marginal difference I mentioned before between the good that Matt could do and the good that the second best person in the field could do. So that's why Matt thought that he could do more good working for this trading firm and donating a lot of money to Oxfam than he could do if he were to go to work for Oxfam. I know that some of you may also think that perhaps he's actually, as well as doing good by donating the money, he's doing harm by working for the trading firm. Again, the question is he actually doing more harm than the next person who would have got the job would have done? I would say no, and Matt would say no. In fact, probably he's doing, if anything, he's doing less harm, because at least Matt is clearly a person who thinks ethically about what to do. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made these choices. The next person probably doesn't think ethically about what to do, because again, at least a lot of people working in finance don't really think very much about ethics. So it seems unlikely that Matt would be doing more harm than the person who would have got the job, and quite probable that he'll do less. But if you have questions about that, let's save them. I'll be happy to discuss that when we have time for questions. Okay, so you've probably already got some idea of the values of people in the effective altruist movement. This talks a little bit about it. This is from a blog by this person, Holden Karnofsky, who is a co-founder of this organization, GiveWell. And again, if you're writing down the web addresses I'm giving you, write down givewell.org and have a look at that later. I'll also show you a slide from that website before I finish. But meanwhile, let's just look at these values. What are the values? What counts as improving the world? Remember going back to that early Wikipedia definition, people wanting to improve the world? Well, what is it to improve the world? This is roughly what effective altruists think. It's not my view, but I think it is pretty characteristic of it. So firstly, effective altruists are cosmopolitans or global humanitarians. That is, they are not particularly interested in improving the well-being of their fellow countrymen or countrywomen, right? So if they're Americans, they don't think I should make Americans better off in particular. They think I should make people better off. And if you're Spanish or Catalonian, an effective altruist would not think I want to make people in Spain or in Catalonia better off, but I want to make people better off, full stop, wherever they are and wherever I can make the biggest difference. Okay, what is it to make people better off? Well, there's two values suggested here as ones on which there's consensus. Maybe not the only ones, but important ones. So preventing suffering. Suffering is bad. Pain, suffering, distress, so on. And premature death is bad. Death is inevitable, but to die before your time is something that is, generally speaking, bad. There's also a general agreement about at least part of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, that animal suffering matters. But Holden puts in this how much here because he says there isn't really consensus on how much it matters. So that it matters to some extent, there is agreement on, I think. How important this is, whether effective altruists should be working to reduce animal suffering instead of or as well as reducing human suffering, is something for which there really isn't agreement. And I won't say any more about that today because I will talk about it tomorrow. Now, somewhat more controversially, effective altruists think that things like justice, equality, and fairness are not intrinsically important. What do they mean by that? What they mean is that insofar as justice, equality, and fairness are important, they're important because they contribute to other values, and in particular, to reducing suffering and preventing premature death, or perhaps to increasing happiness. That is, they probably mostly think that these are important for a good society, for a society to flourish, for people to work well within that society, for the society to be able to bring about a higher level of welfare for its own people and for other people outside that society. Yes, you should strive for justice, for some degree of equality and for fairness. But these are not values in themselves. It's not like, as some people say, let justice be done though the heavens fall. Effective altruists would not say that. They would say, if, in fact, the only way to save the world or to save a vast amount of suffering and premature death is to do something that is unjust, then maybe you should do something unjust. It's not a moral absolute. So as that suggests, effective altruists are generally consequentialist. That is, they're concerned about the consequences of their actions. They want to maximize expected value. So they think about the probabilities. That's why it's expected value. You can't always maximize value because things can go wrong. But you try to maximize expected value, that is the probability of doing good multiplied by the amount of good that you will do. And they're not particularly concerned by the idea that you should do no harm or just do some good in the world. Sometimes you hear people say that the first thing is to make sure you don't do harm. Medical students are sometimes taught the Latin tag, primum non nocere, first do no harm, as if somehow that's a first precept that overrides the idea of doing good. Well, effective altruists typically don't think that. They may say, look, it's very difficult to do a lot of good in the world without harming anyone. Sometimes some actions will harm people. For example, effective altruists might think that governments ought to raise money through taxation for an effective foreign aid program, for government programs that help people in developing countries. But obviously, if you tax people and you don't use the tax revenue to benefit them, but you use it to benefit people who are poorer in other countries, there's a sense in which you're harming the people from whom you raise tax. You're taking money from them. Still, that might be the right thing to do. So these are some of the values that effective altruists will generally promote. Okay, I want now to move to a somewhat different philosophical question, and that is whether in fact there are answers to the questions about what it is to do the most good. Because some people in the field of philanthropy question that. Some people think that the judgment is really a subjective one, that you can't really argue about. And here's an example that I've picked. So this is the website of something called Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. It's a very big service that advises people who are interested in philanthropy what they might do with their money. So if they have a foundation, for example, or they want to set up a foundation, or they simply want to donate a substantial sum to charities, they might go to Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors and say, where should we donate it to? And the origin came from the Rockefeller family fortunes, which obviously had its own very large foundations, did lots of different things, and so they thought, well, maybe we can pass on some advice to others. So they are concerned with giving money effectively. They say here, giving away money is simple. Giving away money effectively is an entirely different matter. I agree completely with that. But I am more concerned about some of the things that they say elsewhere. So on the website, again, you can find a little kind of leaflet, a PDF, called Finding Your Focus in Philanthropy. So in other words, what are you going to focus on? If you do want to give money away, what are you going to focus it on? But this is the problem, I think. When you get into this booklet and you try to answer that question, this is what you find. The booklet says, what is the most urgent issue? There's obviously no objective answer to that question. So essentially it's saying, and this is what the rest of the booklet goes on to say, well, the question is really, what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? So, for example, they might say, well, if you're passionate about animals, then give to an animal charity. Or if you're passionate about the arts, then give to the arts. Give perhaps to a museum or art gallery. If you're passionate about global poverty, then give to an organization that's trying to help the global poor. If you care about breast cancer because your wife, who you love very much, died of breast cancer, then give to research on breast cancer. And that's an attitude that a lot of people have, that really, people should just follow their passion. The effective altruism movement does not take that view. So here's one way in which I think, one reason why we ought to reject this view that there is no objective answer to this question. So this is a painting, obviously. I don't know if any of you recognize it. It's by Duccio. Duccio, as some of you may know, was a Sienese master in the late medieval period, regarded as perhaps a transitional figure, moving from late medieval period to the flowering of the Italian Renaissance. So this painting I'm putting on the screen because it was a few years ago, about 5 years ago I think, a little more maybe, it was bought by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, one of the great museums, perhaps some of you have visited it. And to raise money to buy this painting, the Metropolitan Museum appealed to donors, didn't have enough in its regular funds, appealed to donors to make a special donation to help it to buy this painting. So the question that I'm asking really is, if you were one of those people who was approached by the Metropolitan Museum and said, look, we have the opportunity to buy this Duccio, it would add to our collection, we don't have a kind of classic Duccio in the collection like this, then would that be the best use of your money to pay for it? Well, the price that the Metropolitan Museum paid for the Duccio was $45 million. So was that a good use of $45 million given the other possible uses of $45 million in the world? Firstly, well, you can see it quite large here on the screen. This is what it looks like when you go to the Met. It's quite a small painting. And because it's both quite a small painting and, as I've just told you, quite a valuable painting, they're not going to let you get up to it without putting a thick layer of bulletproof glass, or whatever this substance is, between you and the Duccio. So probably the fact is that you're now getting about as good a look as the Duccio as you will get if you actually go to the museum and stand there opposite like this woman is. Maybe you'll get a slightly better view, but anyway, that's where it is. So I'm sure for some people it does enhance their experience of going to the Met to see this, but I don't think it enhances anyone's experience very much unless they're one of a very small number of people who really know and study Duccio. Because most people, when they go to the Met, they are met by a bewildering array of great paintings. And, you know, they essentially, there's a limit to how many paintings you can take in unless you've got the time to keep going back to the Met and spend a good bit of time in every room, because, you know, to really appreciate the paintings, you could spend an hour in each room easily. So it's probably not going to make a huge difference, but it does make some difference. Well, what else could you have done with the $45 million, though? So obviously we can go back to this just to use one example. As I said, Toby Ord used a figure of $25 for his calculation of what it costs to prevent a case of blindness. Some people think that that's too little. So let's say, in fact, as I suggested, that it's, in fact, too little by a factor of 4, and that the cost is something like $100. Well, you can still see that you can save a very large number of people. I mean, if, just to make the math simple, you could say the cost, assume the cost is $90, then you would be saving 500,000 people from going blind for the cost of the Duccio. And if it's $100, then I guess it's 450,000 people. So could enhancing the experience of the visitors to the Met, who admittedly run into the millions each year, be equivalent to preventing 500,000 people or 450,000 people going blind for, let's say, 20 years? I think if you think about that, it seems clear that this is a better value for your money. You might say, well, how can I weigh that up? So I've suggested in one article that one way of weighing that up would be to try to calculate the number of visitors to the Met who see the painting, and compare that with the number of people who blindness could be prevented, and then whatever that factor is, ask yourself, would I be prepared to be blind for that fraction of the, let's say, 20 years that the number of people will be blind? In other words, what I'm trying to do is to say, ask yourself, would I be prepared to be blind for a month, let's say, in order to see the Duccio? And I think most of us would say, no, I wouldn't, thank you very much. Even if I knew that I was going to regain my sight, which makes being blind for a month rather different from being blind without knowing you're going to regain your sight, I think you wouldn't be prepared to put up that. So what I'm suggesting is, if you can make those kinds of judgments for yourself, then there is an objective answer to this question, or at least there's an answer that you can make, and it's just done by doing the mathematics on how many people could you prevent being blind, how many days will they be blind for if you don't prevent it. So say take 20 years, the number of days that is, whatever it is, 7,000 something, and then you get a ratio of the number of people who you can prevent being blind, which is smaller than the number of people who can visit the museum. But you can do the maths and you can say, would I be prepared to be blind for that fractional number of days? And I think if you do the maths, I've worked it out for myself and other people have agreed, it's not something that you'd be prepared to do. So on that basis, I think you have given an answer to this question of, is it worth enhancing the collection of the Met by adding the Duccio to it rather than preventing people from going blind? So it's, you know, we can debate whether that's the best method or a reliable method, but I think at least it shows that it's not obvious that there's no objective answer or no way of answering this question. I think there is a possible way of answering the question. Okay, let's move on a little. So let's just talk a little bit about effectiveness, the effective part of effective altruism. I'm going to be fairly brief because I don't want to go too far over time. This is the organization co-founded by Holden Karnofsky, whose statement of the values of effective altruists you saw before. So this is GiveWell. It's an organization that Holden Karnofsky and his co-founder Eli Hassenfeld decided to set up because back in 2008, you might remember they were the good years before the global financial crisis hit. Back in 2008, Eli and Holden were working for an American hedge fund. They were still in their 20s, but they were earning a lot of money because the hedge fund was doing very well, it was paying large bonuses, and they, together with several other people at the hedge fund, said, we should be giving some of this away to people who can make better use of it than we can. So then they said, who should we give it to? So various suggestions were made, and they said, well, look, you know, if you think we ought to give it to Oxfam, why don't you write to Oxfam and find out what they would do with $10,000, let's say. You know, we're not talking about a few coins in a box here, we're talking about reasonably serious money. And then if you think you should give it to a charity that's improving education for poor African-American kids in the United States, you contact them and get some information from them what they would do with $10,000. And if you think we ought to give it to protect endangered species, etc., etc. So they all did this. And what they got back, despite the fact that they'd made it clear that there were significant amounts of money at stake, what they got back actually really shocked them, because none of the charities gave them the kind of information that they wanted. What the charities did was they sent them glossy brochures showing happy kids having been helped by the charity, or you know, maybe showing beautiful forest with endangered animals or something like that, but no real hard facts on how many people could you help for $10,000, the kinds of things that would really show. These people, after all, were analysts. They were used to working with data. They were used to looking at companies, getting the bottom line. And they thought, this is a bit strange. Here's a large part of American public life. Charity in the United States is a sector worth $235 billion a year. It's quite large. And yet, there was nobody really providing the kind of information that you would need to make intelligent choices about where your money should go. So the group as a whole said, look, this is a vacuum, we ought to help. And Ellie and Holden in particular said, we're prepared to do it if you will give us some money to start an organization. So they were prepared to take a sizable pay cut from what they were getting, but you know, they needed something to live on, and the other people in the group donated so that GiveWell could get started and become an organization. So GiveWell is, I think, the most rigorous assessor of charities in the world, although it's only really assessing American charities at the moment. You can see from the pie chart how many charities it's reviewed, how few charities it's recommending. It's currently recommending, in fact, 3. That slice represents 3 charities. Now, that doesn't mean that the other hundreds of charities it's reviewed are not doing good work. What it does mean is the other charities have not demonstrated to this high level of rigor that GiveWell requires that they are doing good work. It's a different matter to say not proven from saying guilty. So with all the other charities, all you can say is not proven. Their case for effectiveness is not proven to the standards that GiveWell requires. So it's one way in which you can talk about effectiveness, and you can say there are some charities, small number, that have been rigorously assessed and checked out and that clearly are going to do good work with your money. This is the website of that Toby Ord and Will McCaskill set up that I mentioned earlier. They also do some assessment about finding the best charities. So it's worth looking at as well, givingwhatwecan.org. And this is a website that I set up, came out of a book that I wrote, and there's now an organization with this too called The Life You Can Save, so you can look at that as well, thelifeyoucansave.org. This is an example. You might have noticed, if you are quick readers, that on Giving What We Can's website, it said some charities are thousands of times more effective than others. That's a very strong claim. Is that true? Well, here's the example that Toby Ord gives. It's based on American experience, but probably it's not very different here. So one charity that you often see asking for money in the United States is a charity that provides guide dogs for blind people. You can give to them and help them to train guide dogs so that blind people can have a dog to help them get around. It's a good thing to do, isn't it? It's good that blind people should be able to have a guide dog to help them get around. Yes, it is a good thing to do, but it's actually quite an expensive thing to do because the training of the dog and the training of the blind person to handle the dog are both quite labor intensive. Take quite a long time to get a dog that is going to be a useful guide to a blind person and the blind person to work with it. So the cost in the United States is around $40,000. So again, you know, just to keep using the same figures, and I'm certainly not of the view that the only good thing you can do with your money is to prevent blindness, but again, depending on whether you think it costs $25 to prevent a case of blindness or $100 or something like that, either way, you're going to get you're going to be able to prevent hundreds of cases of blindness for the cost of training a guide dog. At the high end, at the $100 end, you're going to be preventing 400 cases of blindness to train one person. So if what you're interested in is helping people who are blind, it seems clearly better to prevent someone going blind at all than to provide a guide dog to a person who is blind. And that's not unusual because the comparison is helping somebody in a developed country and helping something in one of the developing countries, in some of the world's poorest nations. And generally speaking, it is going to be much cheaper to help people in extreme poverty in the developing countries than it is to help people in developed countries. So even though I know there are poor people in Spain, as of course there are poor people in the United States, in Australia and elsewhere, the nature of the poverty is different in developing countries. The level of poverty is much more severe. And because of that, the amount that your dollars can do is much greater. So there aren't people in the United States, and I'd be prepared to bet there aren't people in Spain who are blind because of trachoma, because of a preventable thing like trachoma. That is, it does get prevented. And there are people who are blind in developing countries because they have cataracts. They're usually rather older than the people who become blind because of trachoma, but they can't afford to get their cataracts removed. Again, I'd guess that there'd be very few people in Spain who are blind because they have cataracts, because removal of cataracts is a simple operation that would be provided for on the public health service that you have. So that's another example of how your money goes further, helping people who have substantially less than we do. All right, I will conclude by saying a little bit about the ethical foundations of effective altruism and the motivations that people have. So what's the foundation? So some people think that reason can only serve our desires. This is the clearest philosophical statement of that view from the great 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. If that were true, then reason could not really tell us whether we ought to be effective altruists or not. The question would be, do we want to be effective altruists? Do we have a passion or a desire to be an effective altruist? If so, then it's rational to try to be one. If not, then it's rational not to be one. But I don't accept that view, and I share the view of the great 19th century philosopher and English utilitarian, Henry Sidgwick, who makes this claim that the good of any one individual is of no more importance from the point of view, if I may say so, of the universe than the good of any other, unless, that is, there are special grounds for believing that more good is likely to be realized in the one case than in the other. So the starting point, Sidgwick is saying, is that our own good is of no greater importance than anyone else's good. That's the basis of an ethical outlook, and this is not, according to Sidgwick, just a matter of, is this what you desire, that you desire to take this view? It is, he argues, an objective insight, an insight that we can obtain through reasoning. And he goes on to say, it's evident to me that as a rational being, I'm bound to aim at good generally, so far as it is attainable by my efforts, not merely at a particular part of it. So, if we're rational, Sidgwick is saying, we should be looking at good in the most general way, as I said, as effective altruists do. Not just my own good, not just the good of my immediate family, not just the good of my fellow Catalans or Spaniards or Europeans or people of my race or religion, but at good generally. And Sidgwick says we're morally bound to regard the good of any other individual as much as his own, except insofar as you judge it to be less. That is, if a person has, let's say, less capacity for happiness or less capacity for suffering, then you might say, well, that person's good doesn't matter as much because they can't really feel very much. They can't suffer very much. Sidgwick would allow that to be a difference. But apart from that, we ought to be impartial. So that's the rational basis that Sidgwick argues for. I've defended that recently in a book that uses this phrase as its title, this phrase, the point of view of the universe. Characteristic phrase, the point of view of the universe, with my co-author, Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, who's here with us today, recently published by Oxford University Press. And if you want to have a defense of that argument, if you're philosophically inclined, that's where we have put forward our defense in a much more thorough way than is possible in a talk like this today. Okay, so that's briefly why I think that there is a rational basis for this. Now I'll just say one thing before I stop talking about the other question. Well, to say it's rational is one thing, but does it actually motivate people? Some people might think, surely Hume is at least right that if we're to be motivated by reasons, we have to start with some desire or some passion to get us to move. Just a purely rational understanding of the nature of morality is not going to actually get anyone to do things. We're not that kind of being. You'd have to be a saint or an angel to be moved by reason alone, and we are not purely rational beings. Well, I think, and here again we're agreeing with Sidgwick to some extent, that that's partially true. It's certainly true that we are not purely rational beings, but the rational judgment may be a part of motivation nevertheless. So here's what Sidgwick says about this. He says, in rational beings as such, and again, remember, we're not rational beings as such, the judgment that X ought to be done gives an impulse or motive to action. In human beings, not purely rational beings, it's one motive among others, and maybe not the predominant motive, but it is can still be a motive. So the question is then, how can it be a sufficiently strong motive to operate in people? And in particular, how can it be a strong enough motive to counteract the desires that, particularly in societies of the kind we live in, where we're being deluged with advertising to buy this or live that way or whatever, and we tend to think that success in life is shown by your material standard of living. How can this rational impulse that comes from knowing that you ought to do something, how can that counteract it? Well, here I want to shift to a work by a Canadian philosopher, Richard Keshen, called Reasonable Self-Esteem. So self-esteem, psychologists agree, is an important part of people being satisfied with their life. Essentially, it's an important part of them being happy with the way they're living. If they can feel good about themselves, if they have self-esteem, if they think that the way they live is in reasonable harmony with their values, not perfect, doesn't have to be perfect, but in reasonable harmony with their values, they're much more likely to be enjoying their life and feeling fulfilled and satisfied than if that's not the case. So Keshen suggests that there are people who we can regard as a reasonable person, whose defining commitment is to have reasonable beliefs about the world, about what is in her interests, and about what she ought to do. So a reasonable person will have some views about what she ought to do, and I would say, if she thinks about this, she would come to something like the view of Sidgwick, which in fact is what Keshen is also suggesting. A reasonable person cannot have self-esteem while ignoring the interests of others whose well-being she recognizes as equally significant. So if, like Sidgwick, I recognize that the well-being of someone else is similar to mine, let's say I recognize that another parent will suffer just as much if his or her child dies at the age of 3 from a preventable disease like malaria or measles or diarrhea, as I would suffer if my child died from a preventable disease, then I have to regard that person's well-being as equally significant to mine, and I can't have self-esteem if I just ignore it when I could do something about it. So here's somebody that I knew quite well. This is in a way jumping ahead to tomorrow's lecture because this is somebody who worked for the animal movement, Henry Spira. He's the man who perhaps you have most to thank if, when you buy cosmetics, you look for cosmetics that are labeled not tested on animals, because his work against the cosmetics industry to stop them testing on animals was a major factor in the fact that we do have at least some cosmetics that are not tested on animals. So this was Spira's view on life. He wasn't really concerned with what he called consuming products and generating garbage. He felt that he liked to look back on what he'd done with his life and I should perhaps mention here that he said this to me at a time when he knew that he didn't have very long to live. He'd been diagnosed with an incurable form of cancer. But he was satisfied with his life. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was satisfied with what he'd done because he felt he'd used his life well to make a difference in the world. He'd done his best to make it a better place for others. And in doing that, it wasn't a kind of an onerous duty that he didn't want to follow. It was rather that he felt best when he was doing that well, when he was thriving. So I think he had self-esteem because he felt that he was doing good in the world as he understood it. And I'll just close by going back to the two co-founders of GiveWell, Ellie and Holden, who have said something fairly similar about, as I said, they took a big salary cut, both of them, to set up GiveWell. And they say that they're also motivated to make the world a better place, that it's an exciting, energizing, and intellectually interesting to be in a position where we're trying to do as much good as possible. So I think that if you think of it in this way, and you ask yourself, what am I giving up? And you're giving up a certain amount of material wealth, but all of the evidence suggests that once you get above a certain level, which is not a very high level, additional material wealth doesn't make very much difference to your level of happiness. Sort of, you know, the curve is quite steep when you're very poor, and then it starts to plateau almost, maybe goes up very slightly, but much more slowly. So you're giving up some material wealth, but you're getting something much more satisfying and much more rewarding for it, and I think that can provide a form of rational motivation for the kind of life that we've been talking about. I think I'm pretty much out of time, but I know we're going to have some discussion, and at some stage in the evening we will be having some questions as well. Thank you.